Not all sounds coming from heaven were cacophonous, clamorous, or dissonant. Some were quite melodious and pleasing. An enduring image from John's Apocalypse is the angel and the harp. The 4 beasts and the 24 elders before the throne of God also played the harp. Like the sound of the trumpet, the sound of the harp will be heard during the events of the second coming. With its pleasant sound, it will represent praise unto God and the prayers of the saints. The harp is an ancient instrument predating John and his Apocalypse by millennia. According to Genesis and the Book of Moses, Jubal, a descendant of Cain, was the inventor of both the harp and the organ. The ancient harp is not the one we recognize today. Its size, shape, and number of strings varied. Sometimes it was played by hand. At other times it was played with a small plucking instrument called a plectrum. The harp was not solely a biblical instrument. It was found throughout the ancient world. The presence of the harp throughout the ancient world testifies to the fact that it was not the invention of one culture, let alone an artifact of John's revelation. It was a universal musical instrument. If Jubal was the inventor of the harp, which the scriptures maintain, then the invention of the harp preceded the nations and cultures of the world as we know them. Though the Bible does not make the connection, Jubal got the idea for the harp and the organ from the heavens, from the polar configuration. Like the trumpet, the harp was first heard in the heavens before man reproduced it on earth. The form of the harp was derived from the polar configuration. The triangular or arched body of the harp was derived from the crescent on the planet Saturn. The strings of the harp mimic the plasma streamers radiating from the planet Venus. The sound produced by the harp sought to replicate the sounds emanating from the planets above. Even today, the planets can produce sounds similar to that of a harp. The following recording of the sounds from the rings of Uranus provide a reasonable example of what the ancients may have heard. Another analog to the heavenly harp of the polar configuration is the theremin. Invented by Leon Theremin in the 1920s, the theremin is an electronic instrument played by modulating the frequency of 2 variable capacitors. This is accomplished through varying the position of one's hands in reference to what are called antennas. The electric signal from the theremin is transmitted to a speaker, creating sound. Modern Modern versions of the theremin include the capability to create polyphonic sound, which was possible during the electrical environment of the polar configuration. The artist in this demonstration creates polyphonic sound similar to an organ or harp. The trumpet and harp were not the only musical instruments originating from the appearance of and sounds from the polar configuration. The Bible mentions numerous musical instruments used in religious practices. Though the Bible does not always make the connection between an instrument and its heavenly origin, the connection is there. Music, along with its instruments, followed the sacred principle, as above, so below, as in heaven, so on earth. The Old Testament has little to say about music until the time of David. There are fragmentary statements that the ancient Hebrews did have their own music, including singing, dancing, and instrumentation. When Laban rebuked Jacob for stealing his daughters and the images of his gods, he told his son-in-law that he would have sent him away with song and music under different circumstances. The next reference to music is Miriam's famous dance to the Lord while playing a timbrel, which was an ancient tambourine. It is David, however, who is credited with the formal introduction of music as a part of Hebrew religious liturgy. David's Psalms are well known, with over 70 of the 150 biblical Psalms attributed to the king. In many cases, the Psalms were intended as songs to be sung for liturgical purposes. The collection of Psalms constituted a hymnal. David is also considered to be the first to formally institute music as a part of temple worship. He organized and appointed priests to a ministry dedicated to music. According to the scriptural accounts, there were a total of 288 singers and 4,000 musicians. The numbers of courses, singers, and musicians followed the sacred numerology of the polar configuration, like the priesthood quorums of our dispensation. The division of priestly duties to include singers and musicians was not David's idea. It was the Lord who revealed the pattern, which David merely followed. Temple worship included musical instruments of all kinds. The Bible is clear that the Israelites were familiar with and used a variety of musical instruments. David introduced many more instruments to be used for sacred purposes. The prophet Amos credited David with the invention of musical instruments. Though David is credited with the invention of musical instruments, it was the Lord who instructed the king on their design and use. 2 Chronicles records that David the king did make the instruments, but also stated they belonged to the Lord. In the original Hebrew, the instruments of music belong to the Tetragrammaton. The verse is translated variously, but given the context, the original Hebrew designates possession, meaning that the musical instruments belong to the Lord. It was the Tetragrammaton in this case who designed them. The New International Version translation of this verse is clearer. 1 Chronicles makes the same point, substituting Ha Elohim for Yahweh as the name of God. That the Lord himself first conceived the instruments and then gave the design to David to make is consistent with what David told his son Solomon about the temple. The Lord gave David the pattern for the entirety of the temple. This included the structure, the priestly service, and sacred instruments of all types used in the ordinances. The Hebrew translated as vessels is keli, and is defined as an article, utensil, or vessel. Keli is often used throughout the Old Testament to designate a musical instrument. It is the word used for the instruments of music of the Lord which David made. In short, the Lord gave David the pattern for the musical instruments to be used in the temple ritual, which the king then constructed. The Lord's introduction of new instruments for sacred purposes at the time of David was not the first time he had done so. The Tetragrammaton instructed Moses how to make trumpets and when to use them. We learn from the book of Psalms that the trumpets were used to announce the festival of the new moon. The Lord's instructions for the vestments of the high priest were quite detailed. When explaining the design of the robe, the Lord told Moses to place pomegranates and golden bells along the hem. The Lord informed Moses that the purpose of the bells was twofold. First, the sound of the bells would inform Israel of the high priest's ministration in the tabernacle. This allowed them to offer up their prayers with his. Second, the sound was a reminder to wear the appropriate priestly garments in the holy place, thereby avoiding the penalty of death for improper attire. Flavius Josephus believed that the vestments of the high priest had symbolic meaning, representing the earth, sky, lightning, and thunder. The reality is, however, that the vestments of the high priest were modeled after the polar configuration. Josephus is correct that the golden bells represented sounds coming from heaven and possibly thunder. If the bells did represent thunder, it would explain the angel with the golden censer in the Revelation of John. The angel is acting in the office of the high priest, burning incense at the altar. Like his terrestrial counterpart, the sounding of bells would be expected from the lower part of the angel's robe. Or, according to Josephus, there would be lightning represented by the pomegranates and thunder represented by the bells. In fact, John does record that lightning, thunder, and other sounds attended the angel's ministrations. A claim that music was not used for religious purposes until the time of David presupposes that any use of a musical instrument before David was not used for sacred purposes. That is, trumpets, timbrels, and the like were used for secular purposes instead. The Church claims in its entry on music in the Bible Dictionary that Miriam's dance with the timbrel was religious in nature. But on the other hand, the use of the 2 silver trumpets designed by the Lord to call the assembly of Israel to the tabernacle was secular. But the Lord's command to Moses to make silver trumpets and then use them to call the camp of Israel to assembly cannot be considered secular. First, we know that the Lord never gives a commandment that is not spiritual. That is, every commandment of the Lord is religious and not secular. Second, unlike modern societies where there is a separation between church and state, ancient Israel, like all ancient societies, had no such separation. It was, after all, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Calling Israel to assembly by the sound of the silver trumpets was a sacred act. It was a form of ordinance. Another argument supporting the Church's claim is that such things as the tinkling of the bells on the high priest's vestment cannot be considered music. Likewise, the silver trumpets were not musical instruments per se. These instruments, so the argument goes, were not used to produce music as we understand it today. In the modern world, music is the medium of sound normally with a purpose to please aesthetically or to entertain. Of course, music is used in other ways, such as in religious services and civil ceremonies. But there is a very large disconnect between modern music and the music of the ancients. Modern music is meant to please the ear. This was not necessarily the case in the cultures of the ancient world. The LDS Bible Dictionary's entry on music illustrates this point. The Church and its scholars assume that since the music of the ancient Jews would sound noisy and harsh to our ears, there was a defect in their musical knowledge. This is a simplistic explanation. Even children, without knowing the principles of harmony and chords, can make music that is pleasing to the ear. There is a better explanation for the perceived dissonance of the music of the Old Testament. At its very core, music is about the medium of sound and silence and its use within a culture. Music does include harmony, but it also includes sound which can hardly be called harmonious or melodious. Modern music, for example, has at times rejected tonality as a centerpiece of music. The point is that any juxtaposition of sound and silence when used in a cultural context is music. It can be noisy and harsh and still be music. Furthermore, both the silver trumpets and the bells of gold must be considered music. They made sound within a cultural context.